Hello. Over recent months, questions over whether the Army 2020 Reserve Plan is achievable has been extensively discussed in the media. Questions have been raised in relation to the impact on the nation's security of a reduction in the number of regular soldiers and a greater reliance upon an increased Army Reserve. Well, over the past few months, the Army's news teams have been around the world filming the reserves in action. We've seen 4 para jumping over the plains of East Africa, Army medics treating patients with unusual conditions in remote areas of Kenya. The reserves have also been to Italy and Cyprus, working on their basic soldiering skills in preparation for potential contingency operations. They've even been live firing Challenger 2 tanks in Dorset. So we can see how the reserves are changing in readiness for their enhanced role. But there remains the sensitive issue of the recruiting numbers. In his latest formal interview, the Deputy Commander Land Forces, Major General Ranald Munro, is resolute in addressing the recent criticisms and is adamant the plan will work.
We have to be honest with those serving currently, regulars and reserves, but actually with the people, prospective soldiers that we want to join, both the regular army and reserve. So no, I would be honest. And the answer is, a lot of it is going very well. Some of it is not going so well, and recruiting is a challenge, and we're trying to fix that.
But recruiting is the key aspect to it, because it can all go very well. You can have these super great plans, but if you haven't got the numbers...
It will take time to get this rock moving, and once we get it moving, the momentum, I'm convinced, will build. I think we have to be very careful that what we don't do is sacrifice the strategic prize, which is the integrated army, for local tactical parochial gains.
You're talking about some of the critics who've said it's not going well and trying to bang the drum.
That would be the prize. Is the strategic prize is an integrated army, making better use of our reserves, both in terms of new skill sets, thickening, resilience to the army, but also connecting with the nation, which is very, very important. We need everybody to support that, and when people don't support it, that makes our job harder.
Just before we go on to where we are now, take us back. Where were we before the campaign started? How many reserves, or TA as they used to be called, did we have?
Well, before the campaign started, we are around about 20,000 trained Army reservists. The challenge and the target is 30,000 by 2018. How
many have you got now? How many trained reservists have we got right now?
Still about the 20,000 mark. Well, one of the things that the white paper, the FR20, the Independent Commission report said was the first thing to do is to stabilise the Army Reserve, because we were declining, lack of investment in terms of marketing. So we have stabilised. So that's the first part of that, if you like, the plan successfully achieved. We crossed the line of departure, as it were. We started this process. Realistically, at the announcement, the white paper announcement back in July, now is not the time to test the temperature and try and gauge whether we're on track or whether we are successfully getting to those numbers. What we have to do now is set the conditions in society, which again, I'm being honest, I don't think we've done very well up to this point, but we're getting a lot better at it, so that we can then use that as a springboard to increase the recruiting, and that is starting to happen now. We know when we have a marketing campaign, there's a real spike of interest. And to be honest, again, we haven't, I think, done very well at harvesting that interest to bring them into the pipeline.
But you're learning from these mistakes,
We're learning from these things, absolutely right. Any new process you bring in, any new bit of equipment, will always have teething problems.
What do you think personally? Do you think that it's a better solution for the future defence of this nation to have a full-time army of regulars, or this part regulars, part reserves? Which would you do if you were able to wave a magic wand? Which is the best option?
I think anybody in the army, in the reserve, or the regular army, or in the country, we would love to see a bigger army, a regular army. But the reality is, we can't afford the army we had. So we have to cut our cloth. I use the phrase, and I've used it before, as you know, I'm a reservist. I work in the city in London. Even there, we are reducing our fixed cost and increasing our variable cost. So there is a real imperative here based on finances. But secondly, we recognise when we've done our homework and looked at what the future character of conflict looks like, how we think future wars will be fought, we need new skill sets. Many of those skill sets can be found in the reserves and held more cost effectively, if you like, on a simmering basis, in the reserves, which you can then use and top up when you need them. And the third element, and don't underestimate this, And I certainly had this in my visits to all the Army exercises that I visited, and there's 26 this summer, so I got to some of them you saw on the screen, but not all of them. The importance that I derived from the US National Guard, Danish National Guard, Danish Reserves, the German Reserves, how important connecting with the nation is. When people see, the public sees its soldiers, its reserves, supporting local emergencies, for example, that's when there's a real resonance there about what the Army can do for the nation.
Do you believe the nation in perhaps America and other places have got that? The nation itself has understood that and is indeed is supporting, but actually here in the UK, that isn't there yet.
Yeah, I think it's there to an extent. I think people do have a real affinity for the armed forces and always have done. I think
yeah, but the armed forces, yes, because of Afghanistan,
yes,
because of the support. We can see that in some of the charities, Help for Heroes, etc. But what about the reserves? You're not asking for people to buy into the armed services, are you? You're asking people to buy into the reserves, volunteer soldiers.
Well, actually, I'm asking people to buy into both, into the Army, which is now integrated, regular and reserve. So I'm asking them to buy into both. It requires a cultural change. The FR20 report talked about a rebalancing of the compact between defence, society and state. The US is way ahead on this.
Okay, now a common saying in the army is that no plan survives contact with the enemy. We've all used it and we've all heard it. Now, unless you're telling me that this saying doesn't apply to the reserves plan, you must inherently have a fallback plan if this goes horribly wrong. What's your fallback plan?
There is no fallback plan. This has to work because it is the right thing to do, both from a financial point of view, but a skill set point of view as well. Of course, there's down testing, adjusting, and a recalibration of some things. In fact, right now we're looking at some of our basings. Have we got it right? Inevitably, there'll be some changes.
Tweaks.
But the big idea, the sense of direction, will not change. Again, I remember going on a course some years ago. Sergeant Major said to me, you can go north with a bit of east, you can go north with a bit of west, you can't go north with a bit of south. So right now, there may be the deviation slightly east and west, but the general direction, the new integrated army, reaction force, adaptable force, force troop command, and also the rebalancing of the reserves and regulars, those fundamentals will not change.
Now, when I do speak to the reserves, when I go around the world, a lot of them say to us that there's an inordinate amount of time between application and training, and that in the middle there you get some keen people who are very keen, they apply, they get in, and then it takes forever to get them trained, and they just can't be bothered to wait. What are you doing to address that? That's a key aspect, isn't it?
And I said I'd be honest with you, and that is one bit that none of us are happy with. We are in partnership with a private firm, Capita. We have not outsourced or abrogated our responsibility. We're in partnership. Both are working very, very hard, monitoring the process. We're modifying it, and we have made significant modifications to the system, which will get better, including the regional clinics, where we can actually take people through the application process face to face, initially at regional centres, but then down to local TA centres as well, the Army Reserve centres. That's a game changer, Derek. That means we'll take people through the system much more quickly than we are now. Right now, it is not satisfactory.
You're saying you're completely dedicated to this plan and that there is no fallback plan. You would have thought, if that's the case, then more TA centres are opening, but you're closing them. That doesn't seem like a good idea. You're closing a lot of them.
No, we're not closing a lot of them, we're closing some of them. When we sat down with all the stakeholders around the table, capability directors, regional chain of command, Reserve Forces Cadets Association, we looked at a number of criteria by which would guide where we put our bases. Pairing with regular units, demographics, where we could recruit, where we could recruit vocationally, i.e. people who are already trained in civilian life, mechanics, doctors, for example, military intelligence. All of that was conducted over a number of meetings, and what we came up with as a big plan was pragmatic and made sense. Inevitably, when you go down into grassroots levels, there are anomalies, and those are the things I've been asked by CLF to look at. Are there anomalies that does not make sense, or we need to, and this is part of the tweaks we talked about, right. Some of the down testing, adjusting. But the big plan does work.
Now, later on this year, the drawdown of combat troops from Afghanistan will conclude. For somebody who's interested in joining the reserves, what on earth are they going to do? If there's no Afghanistan, there's no enduring combat operations, What are they going to do?
Clearly, operations in Afghanistan and before in Iraq were recruiting sergeants. Men and women join the armed forces because they want to go in operations. After Afghanistan, the proposition is no less exciting. We will be a contingent army preparing for not the war, but a war. That requires a much broader range of skill sets to be trained. And actually, there'll still be operational tours. There'll be overseas exercises. There'll be UN tour to Cyprus. There'll be Africa training teams, for example. Defence engagement is a much bigger part. Different cultures, different countries, teaching people how we train, imparting our knowledge and experience to them. I think it's hugely exciting.
The idea of this new look reserves, the idea that 1 year in every 5 they could be deployed, don't you find that puts people off, the fact that actually their lives could be put on hold once every 5 years?
We certainly have been telling people, and it's in the white paper, we want a new Army Reserve. The rebranding is not simply changing the name from TA, Territorial Army, to Army Reserve. What we're trying to describe is a change of what's inside the tin. We will be used more routinely, and we'll have military tasks attributed to us, and therefore more equipment, but with that comes accountability and responsibility. I think you're right. I think we have probably actually spooked some people, employees in particular, by use of that sort of language. The reality, though, is that we're asking for 40-man training days, which, bear in mind, unless you're very senior, that's weekends, and most people can do what they like at weekends. It doesn't impinge on the workforce, on the workplace. That includes a 2-week Army training exercise with a potential, Derek, and this is really important, potential 1 year in 5 deployment. Only if the Army needs you will we mobilise you. In the interim, if you want to volunteer for overseas exercises, additional training commitment, overseas tours, the UN tour to Cyprus I mentioned, you can do that and step forward and do that depending on your particular circumstances. So actually, the ask is not much more. In fact, it's probably the same that we're getting right now. So I think we have spooked some people, probably unnecessarily.
Okay. Now, in some cases, in most cases rather, the reservists work during the week. You would like them as reserves, and they work in Civvy Street during the week. Now, you would like them to put on that uniform during some evenings and during the weekends. But if they all do that and they're all committed and they give it what you want, which is 100% commitment, then you're going to end up with a part-time army of exhausted, washed-up divorcees, won't you? They'll just be completely finished by the time you've had a go at them because there's no time for anything else in their lives.
No, certainly joining the Army Reserve it requires commitment. But the Army Reserve, or the TA, has been in existence for over 100 years. That hasn't changed. So the people we want to volunteer, the commitment we want them to display, and what we're asking for them, in many respects hasn't changed. So what's changed is the Army recognising we are now part of the order of battle, and the level of training, the level of output and capability we are required to generate will require us to be trained more appropriately, with better equipment, and more regularly with our regular counterparts. So some of those things have changed, but the constants remain: the values and standards, the commitment required. But no, they won't be washed up. In fact, they'll go back to the workplace again. In my experience, invigorated, re-enthused, which they then take from the Army into the workplace. Don't forget also that actually, for an employer, we will do a lot of the training that benefits the employer. We'll accredit that training so they can actually see what they're getting.
What I find difficult to balance is, on one side you're saying, no, we won't be putting so many demands upon you that it becomes unworkable. And yet on the other hand you're saying that the reserves is a credible addendum, as it were, to the Army. But you can't have the both, can you? You either have something that is really quite demanding for the employer and the reservist, and therefore credible as a resource and asset to the Army, or you have it the other way around.
No, I don't see that as a conflict at all. I think we all make the mistake of looking at Afghanistan, which is the high end of kinetic operations, and set that as a bar ready to, is the TA ready? Is the Army Reserve ready? Well, it needs top-up training from where the current training levels now, but so does the regular. But not everything is Afghanistan. I mean, I know now I could pick up an Army Reserve unit, soldier from a unit, with a week's training, send them to an Africa training team doing defence engagement. That's much easier. If there's an emergency, as we had in Cumbria with the floods, the snow in Yorkshire, those sort of events, the Army Reserve is ready. Is already trained to be able to cope and assist the blue light services. So let's not look at Afghanistan as the only benchmark. It's one, but it's not the only benchmark.
In terms of what the reservists themselves will get in this new world, what sort of pension will a reservist qualify for, and when will he or she receive it, and after how long?
Yeah, the white paper I think is very good for reserves. It provided additional leave, it provided pensions. Leave I think kicks in 2014 and pension in 2015. Unfortunately it's not backdated, otherwise that would be quite lucrative for many of us who've been in for a long time. But this is evidence again of the seriousness with which Defence is taking the Army Reserve. 26,000 reservists have served in Iraq and Afghanistan, and 30 have given up their lives in the cause serving the British Army. So these are evidence again, as I say, of taking the reserves seriously and making sure that actually we want the quality men and women to join.
Imagine between now and 2018 things don't quite go to plan. You've already said that it hasn't started perfectly, but there is still time. At what point along this timeline will you rethink your plans and then perhaps go back to the politicians and say to them, do you know what, it's not working, we need to rethink this?
The prize is too great to give up on this. We are testing where we are almost on a weekly basis in terms of recruiting, on the training side, the changes we're making on the processes and the policies. Formally, we will test the temperature at 2015. That's when we will look at it and say, right, where are we? Do we need to down test and adjust and tweak? But as I said before, we're going north with a bit of east and a bit of west, but we're going north.
Okay, well, you're going to be here for a bit of time. I'm going to be here for a bit of time. We will hold you to account and see whether things do indeed, as you say, as you're adamant, that they will improve. We'll see if that happens. But
Yep.
for the time being, General Munro, thank you very much indeed for joining us.
Thank you.